The American people have watched with deep sorrow how your nationalist revolution was betrayed.
You, the reporters, are wonderful. You, the writers, are wonderful.
We are against all kinds of dictators.
Combatientes cubanos.
A tyrannical dictatorship.
The only place in the hemisphere where human rights are trampled upon.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right.
I'm appealing to the young people of Cuba who will lift something up, build something new.
A critical focus of our increased engagement will continue to be improving the Cuban government's respect for human rights and advocating for democratic reforms within Cuba.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas.
Our relationship with Cuba is at yet another fork in the road. Fidel Castro is dead, and President-elect Trump says if Cuba does not change, he'll strike the deal. Tonight, we'll explain how and why Castro seized power, our complicated history, where we go from here, and what it means for Florida. Plus, we have more big changes in Washington, more drama in Trump's transition, and a recount in the works in 3 states.
It's been so exciting to see people mobilize.
It is a total and complete hypocritical joke.
This is Money, Power, and Politics.
Okay, Marissa, we've got a lot of ground to cover tonight, and we'll start with our Crossroads with Cuba.
Yeah, you and I traveled to Havana earlier this year to document the changes under President Obama, and the Trump administration may change a lot more.
Certainly might, but before we work through the next steps, we want to put this in context and explain why the politicians disagree on how to proceed, because to know where we're going, we have to know where we've been.
Along the skyline of Havana, you still see the remnants of the iron fist of Spain. The Spanish conquerors built this fortress to protect what they had seized. Cuba's military governor, Hernando de Soto, then sailed on to Tampa Bay, landing at what we now call De Soto National Park. But while Spain eventually let go of Florida, it bared down on Cuba until the independence movement took off once again from Tampa. Cuban guerrillas rose up against their conquerors, and when a U.S. warship called the Maine sank in Havana, maybe due to a boiler explosion, American journalists blamed it on Spain. And so the U.S. declared war. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders sailed yet again from Tampa to Cuba, and so Cuba slipped from the grip of Spain to the grip of the United States. It became a U.S. protectorate, and we took over, or leased, Guantanamo Bay as a permanent naval base. Havana became a playground for American tourists. Then in 1952, a corrupt dictator named Batista seized power. He struck deals with the American mafia and profited from casinos and brothels and organized crime while the people suffered. So Fidel Castro came along. He led a rebellion from the Sierra Maestro Mountains. People fed up with Batista's corruption and abuse joined his fight and swept Castro into power in 1959. America was hopeful about Castro at the time. You may not believe what he said at the National Press Club in Washington.
We are against all kinds of dictators. We are not agree with communism.
But after he spoke out against dictators and communists, Castro became a communist dictator. He seized billions in American assets and jailed and murdered his critics. Soviet Premier Khrushchev declared Castro a hero of the Soviet Union. America severed ties and imposed a trade embargo. Then, in 1962, a U-2 spy plane revealed Soviet missile bases going up that could annihilate the United States. President Kennedy ordered a blockade.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
It took us to the brink of a nuclear World War III, but Khrushchev blinked and turned back his ships with their missiles on deck. From there, Cuba relied on the Soviets for help. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba suffered. American leaders continued to squeeze Cuba in hopes that it would drive the Castro regime from power. Until December of 2014, when President Obama changed more than 50 years of foreign policy in one fell swoop.
Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba.
He relaxed travel and banking restrictions, and then the president traveled to Havana and stunned the people of Cuba.
The rule of law should not include arbitrary detentions of people who exercise those rights. And yes, I believe voters should be able to choose their governments in free and democratic elections.
He called on young Cubans to rise up and drive change on state-run TV right in front of their dictator.
I believe citizens should be free to speak their mind without fear, to organize, and to criticize their government.
Cubans told us they could not believe it, and then we started hearing some whispers about corruption. For example, Cuba has a dual currency system in which the money tourists exchange is worth much more than the Cuban peso. And some told us off camera that corrupt officials are constantly taking cuts or demanding kickbacks of whatever money comes in. In other words, they compared the Castro regime to the American mafia. But some told us it's also important to have Americans here because it gives Cubans insight and perspective that could drive the real change they need.
But of course, Marissa, that approach may certainly end with the next administration.
Yeah, President Obama drove the Cuba thaw on his own. The next president could refreeze it on his own, and the death of Fidel Castro could speed things along.
Falleció el comandante en jefe de la revolución.
Fidel Castro put his brother Raúl in power 8 years ago. His death will probably not change the dictatorship in Cuba, but it could drive some big changes in the United States. President-elect Trump's allies are already urging him to slam the door on Cuba.
He wasn't a romantic figure if you were being shot by him. He wasn't a romantic figure if you were being driven off the island, as hundreds of thousands were.
On the campaign trail, the president-elect sent mixed signals on Cuba. Just before the election, he hammered the Obama administration for restoring ties and easing travel restrictions. Mr. Trump said he may reverse that.
But all of the concessions that Barack Obama has granted the Castro regime were done through executive order, which means the next president can reverse them. And that I will do unless the Castro regime meets our demands.
Fidel Castro's death is now giving some of his strongest critics an opening to advise and lobby Trump to follow through on what he said.
The only thing Fidel Castro has been successful at was staying in power, period.
Cuban dissident Guillermo Farinas, who is jailed in Cuba, claims the repression has gotten worse since our thawing relations.
There has been increased repression, incarcerations, assaults, and torture because the government felt the deal legitimized their actions.
On the other hand, President Obama says the more we open and expose the people of Cuba to the United States, the more likely they may be to drive change from within. It will continue to drive a hot debate in Washington.
Well, this whole situation is also driving a sharp debate in sports. Here's how Miami greeted 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick after a sports writer asked him about a shirt he wore featuring Fidel Castro.
And you hear the crowd immediately letting their feelings known on Colin Kaepernick.
Now fans have already booed Kaepernick for kneeling during the national anthem this season, then wearing a picture of Fidel and bragging about Castro's education system. Revved up those boos in Miami yesterday. Here's his shirt labeled "Like Minds Think Alike." It shows Malcolm X alongside Castro. Kaepernick dodged questions about repression in Cuba and focused on education. The argument between Kaepernick and the sports writer reflects a broader debate that's playing out tonight. Here's what the 49ers quarterback said during yesterday's press conference.
What I said was I agree with the investment in education. I also agree with the investment in free universal health care. As well as the involvement in helping end apartheid in South Africa. You know, I would hope that everybody agrees those things are good things. And trying to push the false narrative that I was a supporter of the oppressive things that he did is just not true.
So yes, Castro has been lauded for the literacy rate in Cuba and parts of the world and for his healthcare system as well, but he's also been reviled for decades of repression and tyranny and firing squads and corruption, and his death, though symbolic on the surface, may have a much bigger impact on our relationship with Cuba. Now, coming up, we're going to explain Cuba's unique relationship with Tampa Bay and what Tampa Bay could gain or lose from a reversal in policy.
And we have some very unusual moves in Trump's transition and a plan to recount votes in 3 states. We'll show you what to expect after the break. Well, as we mentioned earlier, this year we both traveled to Havana on special assignment to show you a side of Cuba most Americans rarely ever get to see.
And along the way, we found a very strong connection between the people of Cuba and what they've been taught about Tampa Bay. This was one of American writer Ernest Hemingway's favorite spots, and once again, it's packed with American tourists.
I think it's very good for us.
Humberto Domnash knows English, and he knows something about the history of Tampa from his days in school, because Cuba's national hero, Jose Marti, rallied for Cuba's independence from Spain in the late 1800s from Tampa.
Our national hero, Jose Marti, stayed in Tampa a long time ago. In this moment, he'll tell you Tampa is a very good city and very good part in the United States.
So, like most Cubans, he thinks of Tampa as the cradle of Cuba's liberation movement.
It's a very important part in our history, and he was a big writing too, writing for the children, writing for the people. It's very important for us too. I love Jose Marti.
And while Marti transformed Cuba, Cubans transformed Tampa by settling into Ybor City and running Tampa's cigar factories.
The connection between Tampa Bay and Cuba is direct, and it's long, and it's based on families as well as tradition.
Okay, well, that was Adam Goodman, and this is Adam Goodman here with us on set. Traveled with us to Cuba back in March. So where do we start off, Marissa?
Let's talk about the embargo. You talked about how it wasn't working when we were back in Cuba. Right. When do you think, and do you think this should be lifted?
Well, first of all, thank God, we're now moving into another period in Cuba's history. I think that's one we really want to turn the page on, all of us. What's going to be interesting is to see what the president-elect does, the master deal maker. I mean, I'm sure he looked at the Cuba deal, as he did the Iran deal, as lousy, and he wants to redo it. The question is, how to redo it? Looking at, the evidence of an embargo that frankly has not worked.
I know we hammered you with this on a couple of weeks ago, talking about predictions for the cabinet. Do you see anything else in the future here in the near future?
Well, the greatest cabinet post Derby, of course, has become Secretary of State. I'm on record as having a lot of reservations about Mitt Romney because not only was he bitter during the primary towards the president-elect, he was bitter all the way through. And his foreign policy, credentials and record are kind of unknown. And I'm kind of a big Rudy Giuliani supporter because I think he's kind of made for this position, intelligent, intuitive, and ready to move. However, this has now come down to this kind of decision. The president-elect can either try to show presidential maturity and, hands across the political seas and trying to embrace someone like Romney while taking on a lot of grief from his own base. Or he can remember what he ran against, why he ran for president in the first place, which was he was running against the system. Mitt Romney is the system here.
Now, you've done some work for Rudy Giuliani in the past, have you not?
I have.
You've advised him. How would you advise him in terms of going around and talking up his credentials publicly of Secretary of State? Is that a good idea or bad idea?
Horrible idea. It's very tough to audition for something this public without looking overly hungry for it. You almost want to be drafted. It's ultimately, that's how you want to get there. Though I think Rudy Giuliani's credentials are well known in terms of what he would bring. He would truly reflect what I think would be an emerging Trump doctrine. However, Mitt Romney, the thing that's most attractive, I think, for his supporters is, and I think maybe for president-elect, they see this as a person who comes from business and who may be a tremendous deal maker. You talk about someone as Secretary of State who can maybe put together strong deals. Mitt Romney maybe is fairly strong on that front, and that makes this even more interesting.
Yeah.
All right, Adam Goodman, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Always.
All right, switching gears a little bit, Jill Stein has started the push for recounts in 3 states. Then Hillary Clinton joined in, and that may have irked the president-elect, and he responded with claims of mass voter fraud.
Wait a minute, Trump won. Right?
Yes, he did.
And candidates don't normally claim mass voter fraud when they win.
Nope, not usually.
Especially when facing a recount in 3 states that carry him over the top.
Yep, you're right.
Because that might feed the argument for having a recount that he doesn't want.
Yeah, let's just show you that tweet from over the weekend. It reads, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally.
And he could not back that up with evidence from this year. He cited some studies from years past that have been refuted by academics. Meanwhile, Trump is getting some pushback from people you would never expect. Coming up, Kellyanne Conway rips Romney and appears to rip Donald Trump in the process. What was she thinking?
And we have some new information and new predictions for the transition in Washington. Well, Kellyanne Conway helped Trump win the election, but she may have worked her way outside the circle of trust.
Yeah, she ripped Mitt Romney about as hard as she possibly could, which Trump has also done a time or two as well. But in the process, she may have inadvertently thrown Donald Trump under the bus. She effectively said just considering Mitt Romney as Secretary of State is a betrayal of Trump's supporters.
And since Trump is considering Romney and may not want that described in terms of betrayal, that Conway's stock just went down.
Unless, of course, Trump's just toying with Romney. But I think there's a much better chance she just went off the reservation and that Trump's not too happy about it.
We do know Mitt Romney is heading back for yet another meeting with the president-elect. Romney did rip Trump pretty hard during the primaries, but Trump has said that he ripped Romney pretty hard too. And Trump's chief of staff says the president-elect could take a page from old Abe Lincoln and embrace his rivals.
It is a sort of a team of rivals concept if you were to go toward the Governor Romney concept. But I think that should tell all Americans about where President-elect's head's at.
I heard Rudy Giuliani wanted to be the Secretary of State.
Yeah,
right?
He's not being very subtle about the hints that he's dropping too.
Yeah, he's dropped quite a few. More than hints, he's come out and said that he wants to be the next Secretary of State, campaigning for it. He's traveled here, there, and everywhere. What has he said?
Yeah, he's been pretty forward about it, saying, my knowledge of foreign policy is as good or better than anybody they're talking to. He's also said, you can't say I don't know the world. And whether that's supposed to be a slap in the face to Romney, Giuliani is just not holding back on why he believes he is qualified to be Secretary of State.
And that just can't be helping his stock on this. And with that, there may be a compromise candidate in David Petraeus. He met with President-elect Trump. If he's trying to find a compromise, the fellow who brought stability to Iraq at a time when a lot of people said that could not be done despite the Petraeus scandal could work in his favor. Again, Mitt Romney will have another meeting with Mr. Trump tomorrow. Okay, Marissa, what do we have?
Well, coming up are predictions for Trump's cabinet and the recount in 3 states after the break.
All right, Marissa, here's my prediction. Rudy Giuliani, by talking himself up, may have just talked himself out of Secretary of State. Donald Trump does not want to be put in a corner. With this, a lot of pushback on Romney. It may or may not be him. We'll find out, I suspect, tomorrow night. If it's not, and if it's not Petraeus because of the Petraeus scandal, I think you could be looking at Corker as a possibility for Secretary of State.
I find this whole situation so interesting because they've talked about, throughout the campaign about bringing America together, and yet you have this transition team who's divided on this.
There's certainly a lot of drama, and there's a feud that's playing out, spreading into the public as well. As far as the recount's concerned, yes, there will be an effort to recount. No, it will not change any results because you can't flip 12,000 votes in one state, let alone 70,000 in the state of Pennsylvania through a traditional recount. That's our show. Merce, thanks. We'll see you tomorrow night.